At 3 a.m., in a quiet Washington suburb, 16-year-old Courtney Kuykendall's phone started ringing. She looked at the screen. Her heart stopped. It wasn't an unknown number. It wasn't a blocked caller. It was her. The call was coming from her own phone. She was holding it in her hand. What started that night would terrorize not just her family, but 3 entire households. And 18 years later, authorities still refuse to explain what happened. Welcome to Unsolved Files. And tonight, we're diving into one of the most technologically impossible mysteries in modern crime. The case the FBI solved, but never told anyone about. To understand what's about to happen to this family, you need to understand where they were before it all began. February 2007, Fircrest, Washington, a quiet suburb about 30 miles south of Seattle. Courtney Kuykendall had just turned 16. She was like most teenage girls in 2007, worried about boys, focused on school, obsessed with MySpace, and completely dependent on her new cell phone, a lifeline to her entire social world. Her mother, Heather Kuykendall, ran a quiet household, normal routines, normal teenage drama. Nothing that would suggest, in just a few weeks, their lives would become an ongoing nightmare. It started small, almost too small to notice. One night in early February, Courtney received confused texts from her friends. They were all asking the same thing. Why are you texting us the word gay? Courtney hadn't sent anything. She checked her phone. The conversation history was there. Messages she had no memory of sending. From a phone she knew she hadn't touched to send them. She laughed it off. Phone glitch maybe. Technology can be weird, right? She had no idea this was just the opening act of a horror movie. The next messages weren't random words anymore. The calls came, not to Courtney, to her mother, to her sister, to her friends. And the voice on the other end wasn't muffled or distant. It was clear, it was deliberate, and it was making threats. I'm going to kill your family. I'm going to kill your pets. I'm going to kill your grandparents. And there's nothing you can do to stop me. Heather Kuykendall felt her stomach drop. This wasn't a prank anymore. This was real. When your child receives death threats, you don't wait. You act immediately. Heather called the Fircrest Police Department. She reported everything: the messages, the calls, the threats against her family and her children. She provided phone numbers, dates, times. She saved voicemails. She documented everything. Within days, officers arrived. They took statements. They traced the calls. They investigated. And what they found made no sense. The calls, they were coming from Courtney's phone. The threatening messages, sent from Courtney's cell phone, the family's own phone, turned into a weapon against them. Now, if your 16-year-old daughter's phone is being used to threaten your family, there's an obvious question. Is your daughter doing it? The police considered it. They had to. It was the logical conclusion. But here's where this case stops making sense. The Kuykendalls took Courtney's phone away. They confiscated it. They took the battery out. They turned it off and locked it in a drawer. And the calls kept coming. Not fewer, not less frequent. The exact same calls, the exact same threats, from the exact same phone number, Courtney's phone. How? Fircrest Police Chief John Cheeseman, who had been investigating the case personally, made a public statement that would echo across the investigation. Police Chief John Cheeseman: "We're almost dumbfounded. We've never seen anything like this. These weren't rookie cops. These were seasoned law enforcement professionals, and they were admitting something they'd never admit in a normal case. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Death threats are terrifying, but they're abstract. Their words, they might not be real. Then came the moment when Heather Kuykendall understood. This wasn't someone calling from far away. This person was watching her family. Heather had just installed a new electronic lock on one of the doors, a new security code, security measures to protect her children. Minutes after she activated it, her phone rang. On the voicemail was a message, and in that message, the caller recited the exact security code, the code nobody else knew. Heather's legs went weak. She called her sister Darcy Price immediately. Heather Kuykendall, paraphrased, "They're watching us, they're in our home, they can see inside our house," but they couldn't find anyone. The doors were locked, the windows had curtains. How was this person seeing them? It got worse. The caller knew what they were wearing, not just generally, specifically. "You're wearing a blue shirt, the one with the stripe on the sleeve." Courtney was in her bedroom. Door closed, lights off, and the message came in real time. They blocked their cameras with tape. They took out phone batteries. They bought new phones from different carriers, and it followed them. Because this was never about hacking into a specific device. This was about infiltrating their entire life. By mid-February, Heather Kuykendall and her sister, Darcy Price, had documented dozens of calls. They'd saved voicemails. They'd recorded the caller's voice. They had evidence. So, they made the difficult decision. They invited law enforcement into their private life. A detective from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department came to their home. They sat down. They played the voicemails. They showed the call logs. They explained everything. And while this official conversation was happening, while a police officer was physically present in their home, they did something that would become one of the most documented pieces of evidence in the case. Courtney and Andrea McKay, her friend from across the street, put two cell phones on the table. The phones were turned off. In front of the detective, in plain sight, both devices powered down. And then, while all three adults watched, one of those phones powered itself on, and it sent a text message to the other. A police officer was literally watching a phone do something a phone shouldn't be able to do. The calls intensified, but it wasn't just random threats anymore. The caller was proving they had auditory access to the family's home. They could hear conversations inside the house. The Kuykendalls would have a conversation in their living room, not on the phone, just talking to each other in their home. Hours later, a voicemail would arrive. It contained a recording of that exact conversation, not just summarized, actually recorded. Their own words played back to them by a stranger. Imagine that feeling. Imagine realizing that your private conversations in your own home, with your door closed, are being monitored by someone you can't see, can't reach, can't stop. That's not just fear. That's a violation of reality itself. Detective Ed Trier from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department theorized about what this meant. Detective Ed Trier, paraphrased, "At this point, it's someone that is close enough to them to know this much about them. It seems like it's someone who is tied into the group, a family member, a friend, or an enemy." But there was a problem with that theory. The technical capability required wasn't something a local enemy would have. You don't need to be in the neighborhood to hijack a cell phone. You don't need to be close to record conversations. This required technical knowledge, advanced technical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that suggested military-grade surveillance equipment. Andrea McKay, the neighbor across the street, was having a normal afternoon. She was in her kitchen, doing something millions of people do every single day. She was slicing limes, green, fresh limes, preparing them for a drink or a meal. Normal, domestic safe. And her phone rang. There was a voicemail. And in that voicemail, the caller said, "I prefer lemons." Those 5 words. That's all the message was. But do you understand what those 5 words meant? Someone was watching Andrea McKay slice limes in her kitchen. Through a camera they couldn't see. Through walls they shouldn't be able to penetrate. Watching her hands, watching the fruit. Watching her in a moment she thought was completely private, and then telling her what they'd prefer instead. It wasn't a death threat, but in many ways it was worse, because it proved the threat was real, proved the surveillance was real, proved there was no escape. This wasn't just a stalker making random calls anymore. This was psychological warfare, precision, psychological warfare. Andrea McKay would later describe the impact. Andrea McKay, paraphrased, "I don't know how they're doing it, but they can see us. They can see everything we do." From February through April of 2007, the Kuykendall family, the Price family, and the McKay family lived in a state that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. It wasn't fear that comes and goes. It was constant. The calls came at all hours. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., middle of the night, when sleep is supposed to be an escape, but instead, you're waking up to threats. The family barely slept. Heather Kuykendall would later tell investigators, Heather Kuykendall, paraphrased, "If we go a day without a call, that's a good day." One day without contact from their invisible stalker became a victory worth celebrating. Think about that. That's your new normal. That's what hope looks like. The threats escalated. They weren't just about the family anymore. They were about other people, schools, communities. One voicemail made a specific threat against the schools Courtney and Taylor attended. "I'm warning you, don't send them to school. If you do, say goodbye." The families had to make an impossible choice. Do they keep their children home from school, validating the threat and disrupting their education? Or do they send them every day, terrified something might happen? They chose to send them. They had no choice. But the fear never left. At some point, the police had to admit they needed help. This wasn't a normal case, so they brought in outside experts. James Atkinson, a Massachusetts-based counterintelligence expert who had advised the United States Congress on security issues, was consulted. His conclusion about whether it was possible to remotely hijack a phone in 2007. James Atkinson, paraphrased, "It's not that hard to take remote control of a wireless phone. You do not have to have a strong technical background. They probably have a technically gifted kid who probably is in their neighborhood." A technically gifted kid. That was the expert assessment. But the cell phone company said something different. The carrier claimed that the technology to hijack a phone in the way being described simply didn't exist in 2007. Cell phone company statement, paraphrased, "The technology to do this doesn't exist." So you had a contradictory situation. An expert in counterintelligence saying it was possible, a major cell phone company saying it wasn't, and a family with documented evidence that it was happening. Who was telling the truth? Nobody knows, because nobody was allowed to see the full investigation. By late April 2007, the case had escalated beyond local police. The FBI became involved. This is a significant detail. The FBI doesn't investigate random prank calls. The FBI investigates federal crimes, cybercrime, terrorism, organized crime. The fact that the FBI took jurisdiction tells you how serious law enforcement considered this case. The FBI arrived. They took over the investigation. They interviewed the families. They reviewed the evidence. They analyzed the recordings. And then something remarkable happened. The calls stopped completely. abruptly, like flipping a switch. After 4 months of constant, relentless harassment, calls at 3 a.m., recordings of private conversations, precise surveillance knowledge, everything went quiet. The families weren't told what the FBI found. They weren't told if the case was solved. They weren't told if someone had been arrested. They weren't told anything. The investigation simply closed. The case files were sealed, and the public was left in darkness. To this day, 18 years later, there has never been an official statement about what the FBI discovered, whether the caller was caught, whether charges were filed, whether it was a hoax. Nothing. The silence from federal law enforcement is, in its own way, as mysterious as the case itself. But here's where the story takes another dark turn. After the FBI's involvement and the sudden end to the calls, you might think the families would finally get support from local law enforcement. Some acknowledgement of the terror they'd endured. Instead, they got the opposite. Months later, Fircrest police started suggesting that maybe the families had made the whole thing up, that maybe it was an elaborate hoax. The families may have made this up, but there was a problem with that theory. 3 separate families in different homes reported identical experiences. They didn't all know each other well enough to orchestrate such an elaborate hoax. And the technical evidence, the phone calls traced to Courtney's powered-off phone, the recordings of private conversations, that was documented. Pierce County Sheriff's Detective Ed Trier had theorized that the perpetrator was likely someone close to the family, but he also left room for another possibility. What if this wasn't a person at all? What if it was something else? What if someone was testing experimental surveillance technology on civilians? What if this was a controlled experiment in electronic harassment and psychological warfare? In 2007, the US military was developing advanced surveillance capabilities. Cell phone cloning was technically possible, but difficult. Remote monitoring through cell phones was known to exist for law enforcement use, but using it on American civilians without consent, that would be illegal. That would require cover-up. That would require federal intervention to bury the evidence, and it would definitely explain why the FBI suddenly took over, made the calls stop, and then sealed all the files. We'll probably never know the truth, because the truth is locked behind federal classification. The families survived. Physically, they were never harmed, but psychological trauma doesn't require physical violence. Research on cyberstalking victims has shown that the impacts are comparable to PTSD. Victims experience intrusive thoughts and memories, hypervigilance and constant alertness, isolation and withdrawal, depression and anxiety disorders, loss of trust in technology and other people. For the Kuykendall family, life was never the same. They had lived through something that law enforcement couldn't stop, something that violated their most basic sense of safety and privacy. And then they were dismissed when they sought support. Courtney Kuykendall, the 16-year-old girl at the center of the nightmare, had to rebuild her sense of self. She had to understand that she wasn't crazy, that the surveillance was real, that her instincts about the danger were correct. That's not something you just get over. 18 years have passed since the silent caller terrorized her family. Courtney Kuykendall is now 34 years old. She's married. She's built a life. She works in real estate, helping people find homes, places where they can feel safe. And as of late 2024, she's expecting her first child, a baby boy, who will be born in March 2025. In a way, that's the most powerful ending to this story, that Courtney survived, that she thrived, that she didn't let the trauma define her entire life. But the case remains unsolved, the files remain sealed, and the truth remains hidden. She never publicly discussed the incident in detail again. She moved forward, but I wonder if she still looks over her shoulder when her phone rings at 3 a.m. But before we close this case, let's ask the questions that keep this mystery alive. Question 1. Why did the calls stop immediately when the FBI took jurisdiction? Did they identify the perpetrator? Did they threaten them? Did they arrest someone we never heard about? Question 2. How is it possible for a phone to make calls when it's powered off? A technically gifted kid, military-grade surveillance equipment, an insider at the cell phone company? Question 3. If this was a hoax, as police later suggested, how did 3 separate families, unknown to each other, orchestrate identical technical capabilities? How did they fake calls from powered-off phones? How did they record private conversations? Question 4. Why has there been absolute silence from federal authorities for 18 years? If the case was solved, why not announce it? If it wasn't solved, why not ask the public for help? Question 5. Was this an early test of surveillance technology? Did someone, government or private sector, use this family without consent to test capabilities? Question 6. And perhaps the most chilling. Could it happen again, somewhere else, to someone else, with better technology, with fewer chances of it being documented? The silent caller mystery reminds us of something we need to confront. Our phones, our devices, our digital lives can be infiltrated in ways we don't fully understand. And when that happens, there might be no one to protect us. So, what do you think happened to the Kai Kendall family? Do you think it was an elaborate hoax, a technically brilliant cyber attack, a government surveillance experiment, or something we haven't even considered yet? Drop your theories in the comments below. Tell me what you think, because 18 years later, and we're still looking for answers. If you liked this deep dive into an unsolved mystery, please hit the like button. Subscribe to Unsolved Files for more cases that have haunted investigators and confounded experts. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update